Chronicon Mundi.
Dive deep into history.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here to take your complex source material and extract the essential knowledge, giving you a shortcut to genuine understanding. Today, we are tackling a really foundational question. What are the true roots of modern radical Islamism?
It's a huge question.
It is, because when you look at global jihad and these transnational conflicts, it's so easy to just fixate on recent history.
Right, the last 20 years, the headlines, the specific organizations we all know.
Exactly. But that narrow focus is precisely what obscures the deep, the systemic and ideological origins of this whole phenomenon.
And that's the key. These movements that underpin modern jihadism, they're not just reacting to 21st century grievances. Not at all.
Right.
They are a direct response to a massive political and, I would say, spiritual crisis that started unfolding way back in the 19th century.
And it really hit a fever pitch in the early 20th.
It did.
So that's our mission in this deep dive. We're going to rewind the clock to that crucial transition period. I mean, this is a period defined by two great tectonic shifts.
You've got overwhelming European intervention on one hand.
And on the other, the seismic collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate. We're tracking the ideological turmoil that came right after that moment when secular nationalism, pan-Islamism, and these radical identity movements like the Muslim Brotherhood first pop up.
And they immediately start competing fiercely, all trying to define the future of the Muslim world.
So we're using a stack of specialized sources for this. Studies on the early origins of political Islamism, histories of foundational groups like the Muslim Brotherhood.
And, really detailed analyses of post-imperial political thought in places like Iran and Egypt. These are our flashpoints.
And we're going to pause our discussion right on the cusp of the Cold War, because that shift, that's what dramatically accelerates everything we're about to talk about.
And that will be the subject of our next deep dive.
Okay, let's unpack this foundational crisis. We have to start in the 19th century with the age of European imperialism, specifically the British and the French.
They literally drew the map of the modern Middle East.
And this was never a cartography project aimed at establishing healthy, self-sustaining states, was it?
Not even close. The map drawing was an exercise in pure self-interest. Rivers, mountains, cultural loyalties, tribal affiliation.
All ignored.
Largely ignored, yeah. In favor of lines that serve the economic, strategic, and political needs of London and Paris. And this created a legacy of artificial borders, deep internal tensions, and most critically, a foundation of dependencies, weak political institutions.
What's really striking in the sources is the analysis of how that paradigm, that structure, just endured. Even when formal colonization ended, the core economic relationship didn't really change.
That's the critical insight. The argument presented is that the United States, when they come onto the scene in the Cold War era, they didn't need to send colonists. They didn't need to plant a flag.
Maybe direct route.
No, instead they adopted what's called an informal empire, modeled right on the British and French blueprint. So the relationship shifts from direct political control to, let's say, economic and military integration into the global capitalist economy.
But on terms favorable to the Western powers.
Always. That's the key.
So the mechanism of control changes, but the subservience remains. How did that actually manifest on the ground for these newly independent nations?
Well, it manifested through clientelism and a total lack of true sovereignty. I mean, think about resource control, market access. These brand new states were basically forced into a global system where they were suppliers of raw materials.
Or strategic military bases.
Exactly. Not self-directed economies that could build their own internal strength. And this is where the local elites become so crucial and, frankly, complicit.
Tell us more about that complicity.
Local rulers, whether they were old monarchs or newly installed military strongmen or, bureaucratic elites, they gained and kept their power by doing the bidding of their colonial masters. Or later, their new American partners.
So their legitimacy came from the outside.
Yes, their legitimacy, their military backing, it all came from outside, which meant they didn't have to rely on the consent or the trust of their own people.
That's a devastating self-perpetuating cycle, isn't it? If the people see their own government as just an instrument of foreign interests.
It completely undermines any effort to build sound institutions or public trust, or even a sense of shared national identity.
It just poisons the well from the start.
Precisely. The political development of these emerging nations was, it was profoundly stunted. They were launched onto this trajectory of authoritarianism, corruption, and an economic model that only ever benefited a tiny, connected elite.
And this failure of sort of liberal, secular state building, that's the void. That's the fundamental political void that these radical, identity-driven movements would later just rush in to fill.
That's the vacuum.
So the core struggle that defined this immediate pre-Cold War era then, it became this fight for genuine economic sovereignty. It was a litmus test, right? Were these nations truly independent or just proxies?
Managerial proxies for Western interests, exactly. And we have two incredibly powerful case studies that illustrate this tension. The nationalist fight over oil in Iran and the struggle for full military independence in Egypt.
Let's start with Iran. The events surrounding oil there were just dramatic.
Absolutely. You have Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who really represents the nationalist aspirations of Iran. And he makes this revolutionary decision to nationalize the country's vast oil reserves.
Which brings him into direct, immediate, and brutal conflict with the British government.
Because the British government controlled those reserves through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the AIOC.
And this was a colossal fight. I mean, the sources are so clear that the Abadan refinery wasn't just some big factory. It was described as the greatest single overseas enterprise in British commerce.
The scale of the money involved is just staggering. In 1950 alone, the AIOC's profits brought Britain the equivalent of £6.9 billion in today's money.
Wow. And this revenue was absolutely critical for a British economy that was desperately trying to recover after the war.
It was more than just revenue. It was a symbol of global prestige, of control. The AIOC model was the blueprint for Britain's oil operations across the entire Middle East, in Iraq, in Kuwait, everywhere. If Mossadegh succeeded in nationalizing it,
the whole house of cards could come down.
The entire regional edifice of British control would be threatened, so the British response was immediate and harsh. A total financial embargo designed to starve Iran economically, cripple their ability to sell their own oil.
But Mossadegh, the revolutionary statesman, he saw this crisis through a totally different lens, a nationalist lens.
He did. He recognized the immediate economic hardship, of course, but he considered those losses minor compared to what he called the ultimate prizes, oil and honor.
Oil and honor.
Yes. His priority was, and this is a quote, unconditional independence over everything else. This is the sound of a leader choosing national dignity over immediate economic pragmatism. And that was a deeply, deeply resonant message for a population that had been humiliated by decades of foreign oversight.
And the sources detail how this political storm eventually led to his downfall. London and Washington, particularly after a staunch Cold Warrior like Dwight Eisenhower gets elected in the U.S.
They concluded that Mossadegh was a threat who had to be removed.
And that's where the mechanics of this informal empire really come into play. Mossadegh's removal wasn't a formal invasion.
No, it was a highly sophisticated espionage operation. The sources confirm this was the infamous CIMA M6 plot known as Operation TP Ajax, or Ajax. And the operation was designed not just to remove him, but to fundamentally destabilize his internal support structures.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because that foreign intervention, it capitalized directly on those pre-existing ideological fractures within his own coalition.
Precisely. The coup in 1953 didn't just remove a prime minister, it crushed Iran's best chance at developing a liberal constitutional democracy guided by a popular nationalist leader.
And the psychological impact of that. I mean, seeing a nationalist hero who was prioritizing his nation's dignity overthrown by Western powers.
And then replaced with an autocratic Shah who was so clearly their client. The impact was profound and it was lasting. This moment of blowback is directly, you can draw a straight line to the radicalization that culminates in the 1979 revolution.
Okay, now let's turn to the other major nationalist icon of this period, Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. He comes to power after the 1952 Free Officers coup, and he shares Mossadegh's fundamental priorities.
Right, expelling the British military and driving state-directed modernization.
But the Egyptian struggle has this fascinating historical irony to it.
It really does. The British themselves had inadvertently created the conditions for their own expulsion. The 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty called for the withdrawal of most British troops, but, and it's a huge but, it maintained a massive British presence in the critical Suez Canal zone.
To protect that vital artery.
Of course. So it was a half measure that only inflamed nationalist sentiment even more.
And that wasn't the only unintended consequence.
No. Crucially, the reforms that came with that treaty made the Egyptian military merit-based rather than just relying on aristocratic connections. This allowed young men from the educated, nationalist, middle-class people exactly like Nasser to climb the ranks.
And eventually formed the Free Officers movement that seized control of the entire nation in 1952.
The very tool of reform became the tool of their removal.
Now, the sources highlight a core difference between Nasser and the constitutionalist Mossadegh. Nasser was a top-down autocrat. He was in a desperate hurry to remake Egypt.
His vision was far more revolutionary than Mossadegh's. Nasser prioritized rapid modernization, state-directed economic development, and he largely bypassed liberal democracy. He wanted to, in his words, annihilate the old regime entirely.
The monarchy, the social classes.
All of it. He saw the state as the sole engine of progress. He centralized power and focused on pan-Arab dignity and, importantly, non-alignment on the international stage.
And that non-alignment immediately worried Washington, especially after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956.
Which he did right after the U.S. withdrew funding for the Aswan Dam project. The nationalization was an act of pure defiance, of self-determination, and it catapulted Nasser into the role of a pan-Arab icon.
So the Eisenhower administration, viewing the world strictly through the lens of the Cold War,
they saw Nasser's secular nationalism and his non-alignment as a dangerous door opening straight to Soviet influence.
Okay, so if the secular populist path that Nasser represented was seen as an ideological threat, what was the Eisenhower administration's countermove? They could just prop up the old monarchies they'd just seen defeated.
Their solution was strategic and, you could argue, had disastrous long-term consequences. They actively sought to undermine Nasser's secular pan-Arab nationalism by promoting a spiritual counterweight.
A spiritual counterweight, what does that mean?
It meant elevating the conservative monarchies, particularly Saudi Arabia, into positions of ideological prominence.
And what was the logic there? Why Saudi Arabia specifically?
Eisenhower and his advisors, they believed that King Saud, as the custodian of the two holy mosques, held a kind of religious and spiritual standing that could counteract Nasser's charismatic secular appeal.
So fight secular nationalism with religious conservatism.
Exactly. And this policy promoting conservative religious authority to fight the threat of secular non-aligned nationalism is a fundamental part of this post-imperial ideological competition. It created this enduring trade-off where Western powers would fight political threats by, well, inadvertently empowering religious rivals who had radical political projects of their own.
And what emerges from both the Iranian and the Egyptian case studies is this realization that the fight for independence was never unified. It fractured immediately along these deep ideological lines,
creating fundamental cleavages that radical groups would later exploit. This internal fracture is the true seedbed of the political instability that follows. In Iran, within Mossadegh's own National Front coalition, the sources clearly identify two massively divergent forces.
Two forces vying for the soul of the new state. Describe them for us.
Okay, on one side, you had the traditional middle class. The conservative, religious, mercantile elements, we're talking primarily about the bazaris and the clerics.
The bazaris being the merchants, the shopkeepers.
The backbone of the traditional urban economy, yeah. The people who operated outside the state-controlled modern sector. And they were naturally allied with the clerics because their conservative social vision was intertwined with religious law and tradition.
So they represented the conservative economic and religious backbone of the society. What was their vision for the state?
They esteemed Islam as a whole way of life, which means that Sharia, Islamic law, should be the principal legal and political authority. Their nationalism was rooted in cultural authenticity and resisting what they saw as Western moral corruption.
And the opposing faction.
That was the modern middle class, the forward-looking, secular, and technocratic intelligentsia. These were the educated elites, often trained abroad or in secular state institutions, engineers, lawyers, civil servants.
And they were inspired by European models of state building.
Completely. They favored a clear separation of religion from government.
So even in this great moment of national liberation, they disagreed on the most fundamental purpose and structure of the state.
Absolutely. The intelligentsia, the seculars, they wanted to create a modern, centralized state that could compete on the world stage. They believed religion was a private affair. The traditionalists, on the other hand, saw secularism itself as a Western imposition, as morally bankrupt and leading to exploitation.
Which means that early nationalism, this liberal constitutional project under Mossadegh, was deeply vulnerable.
Extremely vulnerable. So when that secular path was violently crushed by the Western-backed coup, It didn't just damage democracy, it massively discredited the secular intelligentsia in the eyes of the traditional middle class.
And that failure allowed these more radical, identity-driven ideologies to just flourish at the expense of liberal constitutionalism.
Exactly.
So we've established this internal political strife caused by foreign powers and these deep ideological differences. But while all of this is happening, an even older, deeper foundation for identity, the supreme central authority of the Muslim world, was completely removed from the equation.
And this is section 2. This represents a kind of theological trauma that you could argue far exceeds any territorial loss. In 1924, the Turkish National Assembly, under the direction of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk,
The founder of the modern Turkish Republic.
yes, they abolished the caliphate entirely.
And this wasn't just the end of the Ottoman dynasty, which was already on its last legs. This was the end of a religious office that, for over 1,000 years, had symbolized the political unity and sovereignty of the entire worldwide Muslim community, the Ummah.
And the sources really underscore this. This single act created an enduring existential problem for Islamic jurisprudence that still resonates today. The crisis centers specifically on the concept of offensive jihad.
Jihad al-Sayf, the jihad of the sword.
Yes. Formal expansionary warfare waged to extend the domains of Islam.
Why did abolishing the caliphate make that particular kind of struggle so problematic?
Because traditionally, offensive warfare was only considered legitimate when it was declared by a proper central authority. And that authority was universally understood to be the caliph. He was the commander of the faithful, the successor to the Prophet Muhammad's political authority.
So if the caliphate ceases to exist, the mechanism for declaring a formal, expansive, offensive, holy war just vanishes with it.
The command structure is gone. There is no legitimate authority left to issue the command.
So what does that mean for later ideologues?
It means they had to perform theological acrobatics. Decades later, if they wanted to justify a perpetual or transnational struggle, they couldn't rely on that traditional framework of offensive jihad anymore.
So what was the workaround? What was the theological hurdle, and how did they get over it?
The workaround was to shift the entire justification for struggle to the framework of defensive jihad. Now, this concept is universally accepted in Islamic jurisprudence.
The idea that if Muslim lands or communities are attacked, defending them becomes a personal obligation.
A personal obligation. The fard ain on all Muslims. And that is never controversial. Never.
So later figures could reframe everything as defensive.
Precisely. The sources show that figures like the Afghan jihad leader Abdullah Azzam, writing in the 1980s, based his entire platform on this one idea, that defending Muslim lands from a foreign attack is the first obligation after faith. This repurposing of doctrine framing every struggle, no matter how distant or aggressive, as fundamentally defensive, was the direct logical result of the caliphate's abolition in 1924.
It's the ultimate act of ideological repurposing driven by a political vacuum. But I can't imagine the response to this monumental collapse was just silent resignation. What was the immediate global Muslim response?
The response was one of panic and desperate attempts to restore that central authority. Within 2 years, in 1926, major conferences were held. The most notable was the Caliphate Congress in Cairo.
And who attended that?
Muslim leaders and scholars from all across the world, from India to North Africa. They tried, with great urgency, to decide on a new caliph, or at least some kind of structure for pan-Islamic unity to replace the office.
And what was the outcome of these conferences?
They failed completely. Regional rivalries, the differing legal schools, the new competing nationalist interests of all these different states, it made any kind of unified agreement impossible.
So the failure of that 1926 Cairo Congress just confirmed it.
It confirmed that the caliphate was not coming back, and this left the world Muslim community politically orphaned. It confirmed that the future would be defined by the scramble for power and identity among fragmented states and competing ideologies.
And this double trauma, the humiliation of foreign intervention, and this devastating theological vacuum left by the caliphate.
It created the perfect intellectual and political conditions for a desperate search for a new identity, a new path forward. And two main competing visions immediately emerged to fill that void.
On one side, we have the secular path, which is really epitomized by pan-Arab secular nationalism, with Gamal Abdel Nasser as its primary symbol.
Nasser's vision was all rooted in modernization, state-directed economic development, and this idea of pan-Arab dignity, that all Arabs should unite to resist foreign domination.
So he believed the Muslim world could succeed by adopting the modern, secular tools of the West.
The institutional tools. Yes, like state control over industry, meritocratic institutions, but rigorously rejecting Western political and economic domination. His was a statist, centralized approach designed to deliver power and dignity and to deliver it quickly.
And as we discussed, the Eisenhower administration deliberately tried to counter this secular path by promoting conservative religious monarchies like Saudi Arabia.
Which brings us directly to the countervision, political Islam, or Islamism. And a key precursor who provided the philosophical blueprint for this movement was Sayyid Abul Ala Maududi. He was operating out of British India and later Pakistan.
Maududi was a hugely significant public intellectual. His influence went far beyond South Asia, and he was deeply shaped by that colonial experience, wasn't he?
Deeply. But his solution was an absolute wholesale rejection of Western political models. He was philosophically uncompromising. He argued, and this is a quote, that Islam is the very antithesis of secular Western democracy.
Wow.
He equated secularism, which he saw as a direct product of colonialism, with exploitation, moral decay, and political servitude. He insisted that this new era of independence required Muslim states to define their future entirely based on Islamic principles, not these borrowed Western frameworks.
His impact seems enormous. How did he manage to get such mass public support for such a radical idea?
His training as a journalist was absolutely crucial. He didn't write for academic circles. He used a populist, accessible writing style. He made these sophisticated philosophical arguments available to the common reader, and he channeled his political energy into action.
He founded Jamaat-e-Islami,
which was essentially the South Asian equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood, a movement dedicated to promoting Islamic activism worldwide.
So if Nasser focused on national dignity through state power,
Maududi focused on national dignity through ideological purity and the rejection of all secular models.
He popularized the concept that independence means nothing if the society and the state are still operating under secular law.
He saw it as a form of continued intellectual slavery, and his ideas provided the rigorous ideological foundation for the political Islamists who were trying to displace the secular nationalists.
Now, it's important to note that Maududi's focus was primarily on social and political reform, but the intellectual seeds of the extremism that defined later transnational jihad movements, they were built on much older hardline doctrines.
Yes. The new movements needed an internal history, a sense of ideological purity that predated all the perceived compromises of the modern era. And that is where we turn to historical figures often cited as the philosophical godfathers of later Islamist extremism.
Let's talk about the 14th century jurist, Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah.
Ibn Taymiyyah, a hardline Hanbali jurist. He's invoked constantly because he championed the idea that rulers who fail to govern by strict Islamic law or who adopt the laws of non-believers should be considered apostates.
And therefore legitimate targets of rebellion.
Crucially, his concepts were originally directed at corrupt Muslim rulers of his own time, but his ideas were later pulled out of that context and weaponized by 20th century groups to justify fighting their own secular governments.
So he provided the philosophical tool to declare jihad against fellow Muslims who were deemed insufficiently pious.
Exactly. And another essential figure is Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who lived in the 18th century. His significance lies in the political application of doctrine. His core theological idea was the restoration of Tawhid.
The oneness and absolute singularity of God.
Right, which for him meant purging the Muslim community of all forms of idolatry, innovation, and compromised belief.
And how did that theological purism become politically radical?
He entered into a political and military alliance with the Ibn Saud family, and he sanctioned their conquest battles specifically to restore this strict form of Tawhid. This underlying principle of ideological and theological purging was later appropriated and greatly expanded by 20th century militant movements.
So they argued that Islam itself needed purging and defending.
Not just against external enemies, but against the internal enemies, the secular rulers, the compromised elites, the corrupt institutions that had allowed Western influence to take root in the first place.
So by the mid-20th century, we have these two distinct and deeply antagonistic pathways competing for the future of the Muslim world. You have Nasser's top-down, secular, state-led dignity.
And then you have Maududi's ideologically driven, anti-secular vision for an Islamic state built on historical purity and backed by the rigorous doctrinal history of figures like Ibn Taymiyyah.
And this ideological scramble is what gave birth to the most enduring and globally influential political Islamist movement.
The Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan al-Muslimin, founded in Egypt in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna.
And the timing, as you noted, is just so critical. It emerges in that political vacuum left by the caliphate's abolition, and right as Arab nationalism is fragmented and struggling to define itself.
And the Brotherhood offered a singular, unifying, identity-based political platform that resonated so deeply with people.
But what often gets overlooked is that they didn't start primarily as a revolutionary political party.
Not at all. Their initial power, their real strength, came from their extensive social mission. They built schools, they built clinics, hospitals, social welfare systems, especially in areas where the colonial or post-colonial state was just failing to provide for its own people.
So that gave them deep, deep roots in the community. They were providing essential services, which made their political message much harder to ignore.
Absolutely. They demonstrated a powerful indigenous alternative to the failing secular structures. And their enduring ideological core has remained remarkably consistent since the very beginning.
A foundational commitment to the implementation of Sharia, Islamic law.
That's the core.
But the sources also point out a key to their longevity and their adaptability, that the notion of Sharia in the Brotherhood's hands is highly elastic. What does that elasticity look like in practice?
It means that while the goal is always Sharia, the implementation can adapt to the political climate. The movement has, over time, blended this fundamental commitment with calls for what they term a civil state and democratic reform. This lets them participate in parliamentary politics one moment.
And engage in fierce ideological resistance the next.
Exactly. It's incredibly flexible.
Give us an example of how that elasticity works.
Okay, so for a hardline jurist, Sharia might mean the immediate total implementation of historical criminal codes and legal structures. But for the contemporary Brotherhood, the civil state approach allows them to push for incorporating Sharia principles into secular legal frameworks, focusing on issues like morality, education, finance, while using democratic means to gain power.
That adaptability is key to their success against less flexible secular parties.
It is.
However, critics are always quick to point out the movement's inherent tension with modern pluralism.
Indeed. Despite their attempts at democratic rebranding, adversaries have always raised these fundamental doubts about the Brotherhood's genuine commitment to pluralism, human rights, and equality.
And that concern often centers on specific minority rights.
Like those of the Coptic Christian community in Egypt, and of course the role and rights of women in a political system where belief and morality are established as the absolute center of all political activity.
So the Brotherhood became this unavoidable force in Egyptian politics. After the 1952 Free Officers' coup, the new Revolutionary Command Council, led by Nasser, immediately started consolidating power.
And this consolidation was brutal. Nasser banned virtually all the established political parties, the Liberal Waft Party, other movements. But he made a crucial temporary exemption for two groups.
The Communist Party and the Muslim Brothers.
And the Muslim Brothers.
Why the exemption for the Brothers?
It indicates their initial political relevance. Nasser needed to secure at least temporary backing from certain factions on the nationalist street. The Brotherhood was anti-colonial, and at first, they supported the Free Officers' goal of expelling the British.
So this temporary alliance, it shows their fragile political presence right at the beginning of the new Egyptian Republic.
But that fragile alliance was doomed from the start, given the radical difference in their political projects.
Absolutely. The confrontation was inevitable, and it was quick. Nasser, as we've established, he wanted to annihilate the old regime and social classes. He was creating a centralized, secular, military-led state focused on rapid economic development.
And the Brotherhood, while they supported the downfall of the monarchy, had a radically different final vision. It was centered entirely on implementing Sharia and a bottom-up moral reformation of society.
So the secularists wanted to use the military to control society and drive change,
while the Islamists wanted to use the social base to control the state and impose religious law.
And that's the core tension.
That's it. The early political friction between Nasser's secular nationalists and the emerging political Islamists became the definitive internal ideological struggle of the mid-20th century. Nasser soon banned the Brotherhood, and his subsequent persecution, mass arrests, torture, driving the movement underground, had the ultimate effect of radicalizing the next generations of Islamists.
So instead of integrating the political Islamists into the national fabric, the state repression just confirmed the worldview of figures like Maududi.
Exactly. It proved to them that the only way to achieve genuine Islamic governance was through absolute resistance against these corrupted secular regimes.
The persecution of the Brotherhood provided the internal enemy, the near enemy, which would become a central focus for the more extreme elements of the movement in the years to come.
And this conflict established the extreme positions that would define the era immediately following our current timeline.
This is a perfect, pivotal place to pause and just synthesize what we've covered.
I agree.
We've completed a really crucial journey today, tracing the deep, complex roots of modern radicalism back to two catastrophic events of the 19th and early 20th centuries.
First, you have the imposition of foreign imperial rule. It destroyed existing political structures, it artificially drew maps, and it created these weak clientelist states. The failure of liberal constitutional democracy, perfectly illustrated by that coup against Mossadegh, created a massive political void.
And profound public disillusionment. And second, the seismic collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924. That created a theological vacuum, forcing ideologues to discard the traditional authority structure for war.
And instead justify all struggle as non-controversial mandatory defensive jihad against perceived internal or external aggressors.
And this dual crisis led to a desperate ideological scramble. We saw the contest between secular nationalists like Nasser, who sought dignity through modernization and state control.
And on the other side, these emerging political Islamist movements, driven by thinkers like Maududi and organized by groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, who insisted that the solution lay only in rejecting secularism and reestablishing divine law through ideological purity.
So we established the precise context and the foundational competing ideologies just as the world began dividing into two Cold War blocs. The true escalation, the violent radicalization, and the shift toward global transnational jihad movements. That all starts to really accelerate when that geopolitical chessboard lights up.
And that is fueled by Cold War patronage, regional wars, and the further persecution of these foundational movements. And that is precisely where we will pick up our discussion next time.